So what about the genocide of the Canaanites? In the Old Testament, God commands the Israelites go into the land of Canaan, kill man, woman, and child. And I think part of the objection is that, again, there's this loving God who's commanding, right, this complete destruction of this nation.
Yeah, of a bunch of peoples, yeah.
Yeah, how can this be okay?
All right, here's where I think I go off the rails and people are going to think I'm crazy. But I think it's, and it's going to sound crazy, but I think if we get into it, and unfortunately I don't have all the verses memorized, so I'm going to have to paint a broader picture. So you had a flood, Genesis 6. God wiped out all the women and children because there was great evil and violence upon the earth. And God was grieved over the creation that he made. So any aspect of judgment that we need to discuss and anything that's going on in creation starts with the creation week. Again, we want a robust theology of creation, not just because we don't like evolution and we don't like science or whatever we think, but what does the Genesis 1 tell us about God? It tells us that he has sovereignty and authority. He gives us, the earth is formless and void. He gives us form, and he gives it form, and he fills the void. Then he looks at it and he says, behold, it's very good. And he rested on his creation because he said, behold, it's very good. Then Adam and Eve rupture creation, and they transgressed some boundaries, and there they were dwelling in a garden. And then, if you read the first 6 chapters of Genesis, it just kind of spirals, and then he died, and Genesis 5, and he died, and he died, and he died. Then we get to Genesis 6, and it talks about the sons of God marrying the daughters of men, and then there are these crazy little Nephilim going on in there. And so what are these Nephilim? And some people just say they're giants, some people just say they're this, and there's several different interpretations, but I'll just say I believe that the sons of God in Genesis 6 are kind of like, they're higher transcendent beings. We have a tendency to use the term angel, but think of the Old Testament word for God is Elohim. And so when God judged the gods of Egypt, they were Elohim. And I'd want to say that those beings had real status, that the gods of Egypt were real gods. We have a tendency to be like, oh, we're monotheists, and so there are no other gods. No, well, the only way for have no other gods before me makes sense. Like if there's no other people, I'll say, bring no other people before me. You're kind of like, well, that's kind of a meaningless. Now, I think there's only one almighty God. I think there's only one most high. But there are other created beings that are identified as Elohim. So anyway, I think that these sons of God that we see in Genesis chapter 6, Job chapter 1, are not human beings, but they're kind of angelic or Elohim. They're gods in a way, and they have their offspring with these things called the Nephilim. Which and even here's one of the things when you think about Bible difficulties. So in Genesis chapter 6, you have the Nephilim there, and you also see them over in Numbers 13. And the interesting thing in Genesis chapter 6, it says the Nephilim were in the land at that time and also afterwards. And so did they survive the flood? What has gone on here that even Moses or a later editor looked at it and just said, oh yeah, they're in the land at the time and also afterwards. And then we come to Numbers 13, and it's really kind of fascinating. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. And so what we have here, so kind of a purpose in kind of doing all that background is getting at the aspect that there are Nephilim in the land, and I don't think the flood is just this completely arbitrary. He does grieve over humanity that he makes, as I think Genesis 6:6 tells us, but it's part of this transgressing of the boundaries between the sons of God and the daughters of men. And I think this interpretation is verified in Jude. We won't go into it, but Jude, I think, affirms this angelic type being and this transgressing of these boundaries. So part of the flood is a bigger version of what becomes the wiping out of the Canaanites. So if we have the flood background with these Nephilim wiping them out, and so part of the Israelites pushing up into the land of Canaan and wiping out a group of people, I would argue are intertwined with these Nephilim and the Anakim and Rephaim and all these things that are kind of giants. So even when David fights Goliath, part of killing the Goliath is you have these giants in the land that are, I don't know if hybrid's the best word, because it seems crazy to say, but that's what I think is going on in the text. That descending from the Nephilim, descending from them, they've populated the land of Canaan, and part of wiping them out is not just this, oh wow, we don't like the Jews, and so let's wipe out the Jews. Oh, we don't like the Europeans or ISIS or whatever, so let's just randomly wipe out people. But it's intertwined with this transgressing of the boundaries between the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the Nephilim. So why are they wiping out the Canaanites, women, children, everything else? Because they're a corruption of the creation, and because Satan does want to corrupt the seed of the woman. That's part of even much of what we see even when the Israelites aren't allowed to intermarry and stuff like that, because you want to keep a certain seed of the promise. So I would say that the wiping out of the Canaanites, it's still maybe not maybe it doesn't go down easy, but it's kind of like, this isn't a perfect analogy, but if we were to have a foreign species, like if you travel to another country, they're like, bring no foreign species with you because it'll kind of eradicate the native population type of thing. So if you have these Nephilim that are like a native species, or not a native species, but an alien species into the environment that can eradicate everything, part of what you do is you wipe them out. And so I realize that even for the average American, that's probably still kind of a crazy interpretation and kind of a crazy understanding of what's going on there. It doesn't necessarily go down any easier, but I would say in context of the biblical story, the wiping out of Canaanites isn't just an arbitrary thing, but it does deal with a myriad of wickedness and a transgressing of natural order and stuff like that. So,
do you have any resources if someone wants to read more on that?
Yeah, the guy that kind of introduced me to this is a guy named Michael Heiser. He has a book called The Unseen Realm, which delves into, and he has a bunch of footnotes, and I can't think of some of the other sources that you can readily actually find. A lot of dissertations are available online, and so he links to other major resources.
What's his background?
He is a linguistics professor, or he studied linguistics, Hebrew, at Wisconsin-Madison, which is one of the best.
Okay, yeah.
So he's a great Hebraicist. Now he runs like Logos software to some extent, I think. And so yeah, he's not like some crazy guy with an internet page and a blog. He's a legitimate scholar, and he ties to legitimate sources. And he was the first one to kind of really laid it out. And if you look at the genealogies and everything else, tracing down through it, you're like, yeah, this stuff is all intertwined. So it's not this arbitrary, capricious thing, but it is specific genealogies that are being wiped out and people being killed. And so yeah, for the average person, it's maybe not going to go down easier, but it's not your 20th century genocides. You know what I mean? It's not your Adolf Hitler genocide. It deals specifically with wickedness and with a certain thing. Now I realize that if you're a eugenicist, you would still say, oh, it's kind of the same thing. You know what I mean? They're looking at the Jews as maybe being tainted DNA type of thing, or whatever it may be. But I would say that's the inherent narrative of the biblical, or that's the story, that's a biblical narrative. And so if we begin with creation, and that man's made very good, there's kind of this inherent aspect of kind of an anti-genocidal inherent to what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. But now that sin has entered the picture, everybody, I think, no one gets upset if we've eradicated Nazism, you know what I mean? And even the Canaanites had the opportunity to leave the land and repent and make treaties and all this sort of stuff. So there's a lot going on there, and the emotional appeal is, it is, like you read the text, it seems pretty harsh, and it is in our ears. But what's interesting, I think it's Acts 7, they quote it like, oh yeah, and they drove out these other nations, and it's like, to them, it's no big deal. So we have our sensibilities that have influenced us, and we want to keep some of those sensibilities, but we also want to ultimately, when it comes to any moral aspect of things, is submit to God and His Word. What is He teaching about this stuff? And so as Christians, kind of, again, something we'll kind of constantly point out in our apologetic is, 98% of all, if you're a Darwinist, 98% of all species have died out. And if man dies out, I mean, we're just, law of averages will kind of get us, you know what I mean? So the idea that it's good or bad or evil, again, is in the context of Yahweh, the creation, what's good, because even as us, we'd want to stop the Nazis, we'd want to stop the genocidal people, which would mean, we kill ISIS, and we don't think it's evil that we're killing them. And but within that, there's that other tier layer of the sons of God, the daughters of men, that I think are central to the discussion.